A piano sat in silence, yet one note lingered in the air. Welcome to Migrate's Casebook. I am your host, Elderton. Share where you're tuning in from. Hearing from you always makes this journey special. Now the story begins. It was, as Lord Peter later remarked, a perfectly respectable sort of evening for a murder, neither too damp nor too sentimental. The remark was prompted by the fact that the residents of Ashcombe Rectory had been obliged, with a certain stiffness of expression, to admit his lordship into their dimly lit drawing-room, where the single most striking object was a walnut grand piano standing serenely closed and resolutely silent. It had not been touched, so the housemaid insisted, for at least a month, and yet upon it lay the body of the late Miss Honoria Fletch, sprawled with her hand outstretched toward the keys, as though in the act of playing a final discord. The local constable, being of unimaginative but earnest stock, declared it a clear case of heart failure, though he did add, by way of prudence, that the lady might have lost her balance upon rising from the chair. The vicar, thin and fluttering, seemed rather more distressed by the piano's misuse than by the corpse, remarking with some indignation that Miss Fletch had been no musician whatsoever, nor one to lay a finger upon the instrument. Whimsy, who had sauntered in with his customary air of amused detachment, bent over the piano not so much to regard the body as to inspect the pedals. He tapped them idly with the tip of his cane, listened, then remarked, half to himself, "Curious. Perfectly in tune, though no one has troubled to play it. A piano, you know, rather sulks when neglected. Unlike human beings who become positively desperate to be noticed." The room, smelling faintly of dust, candle grease, and something else more acrid, polish perhaps, or resentment, offered little clue to the uninitiated. But Whimsy's long fingers hovered over the floorboard as if he were weighing some private connection. He looked up suddenly with a smile that was just this side of mischievous. "I say, Bunter," he drawled, "have you observed that our late friend here did not trouble herself to disturb the dust on the lid? Remarkably tidy death, don't you think? Positively house-trained." Bunter, who had served too many years to be caught out by irony, merely inclined his head. The constable coughed, uncertain whether to treat Whimsy's remarks as ridicule or revelation. Outside, the church bell tolled the quarter hour with exaggerated solemnity. Inside, Whimsy's gaze flicked from the silent instrument to the open curtains, to the faint impression in the carpet where a chair had recently stood, and with the mildest lift of his eyebrows to the peculiar fact that the sheet music on the stand bore not a note of Chopin or Bach, but a blank stave, untouched and absurdly clean. "Well, well," he murmured, lighting a cigarette with practised indolence, "a lady who never played, a piano that resents its abstinence, and a death performed with theatrical neatness. My dear fellow, we are in for a charming little puzzle." The household, as it happened, was not large, and yet the drawing-room soon seemed to crowd with personalities intent upon either concealing themselves or inserting themselves into the inquiry. Whimsy, still idly flicking ash into the marble fireplace, allowed the constable to summon the staff one by one, as though conducting a village parade. The first to enter was the housemaid, Elsie, a girl with hands reddened by soap and a habit of pressing her apron corner to her lips whenever she spoke. She curtsied clumsily, her eyes darting more toward the body than toward Whimsy, and then, upon the vicar's gentle urging, she launched into her account. Miss Fletch, she said, had been in unusually high spirits that afternoon, though heaven alone knew why, since she had spoken little of late, and had kept herself tucked away in her rooms like a hen brooding upon bad weather. Supper had been served as usual at 7, cold meat and pickles, and afterward the old lady had sat a while by the window remarking upon the bells from St. Mildred's, which she claimed rang off-key. Elsie had cleared the dishes, polished the candlesticks, and gone to the scullery. When she returned, scarcely half an hour later, she had found the drawing-room door ajar, and her mistress stretched across the piano in a manner too dramatic to be credible. Elsie had shrieked, stumbled back into the hall, and summoned the vicar, who had in turn sent for the constable. "Quite so," murmured Whimsy, peering at her over his monocle. "Tell me, my dear, had your mistress ever exhibited a sudden fondness for music before tonight?" "Oh, never, my lord. She couldn't abide it. Said it made her teeth rattle. We've not had a note struck here since before Christmas." "Ah, yet she contrived to expire in precisely the position of a concert soloist. How deliciously perverse." He tapped the ash once more, then smiled as Elsie, puzzled, bit at her apron. The butler came next, or rather, what passed for one. A Mr. Pritchard, heavy in the jowls, more accustomed, one suspected, to the public house than to the polish of silver. He confirmed with the dour certainty of his class that Miss Fletch despised music, though he could not forbear to add, with a smirk, that she despised most things: neighbours, relatives, churchwardens, and, above all, her brother's widow, who lived a mile away and had long harboured some grievance over the Fletch inheritance. "A cheerful circle," said Whimsy, lightly. "Did she ever receive visitors in the evenings?" "None who stayed long," replied Pritchard. "She had no patience with folk. But there was a gentleman last week, come from London, he said, wanting to talk about the sale of some property. She sent him packing within the quarter. Hour, never said why. And what did this property consist of? A ruinous rectory, a windmill, some warehouses by the quay at Tilbury, I think, though what business she had with them I cannot say." "Indeed," said Whimsy, his tone more reflective now, though he offered nothing further. By this time, the vicar's wife, a small, nervous creature whose life appeared to consist of fluttering in her husband's wake, had joined the group, insisting upon making tea as though hot liquid could dissolve the fact of a corpse upon the piano. Whimsy accepted a cup, stirred it delicately, and inquired, with apparent irrelevance, whether Miss Fletch kept the curtains open at night. The question startled her. She looked to her husband, who frowned before replying that the curtains were always drawn at sunset without fail. "Then why?" said Whimsy gently. "Were they open this evening, and the latch upon the casement unfastened? Did the lady intend to serenade the village with her silence?" No one replied. The constable shifted uncomfortably, as though resenting Whimsy's intrusion into his simple narrative of heart failure. Yet Whimsy pressed no further. He only remarked that a draught was the undoing of many a good household, and sipped his tea as though such trifles were his chief occupation. Bunter, efficient and silent, had meanwhile examined the hall, and upon his return bent discreetly to his master's ear. Whimsy listened, smiled faintly, and then, with an air of weary geniality, requested that the gardener be brought in. This worthy, a stooped man named Hobbs, smelled of earth and paraffin, and spoke with a deliberate slowness that suggested both honesty and obstinacy. He had seen nothing unusual that day, save that Miss Fletch had ordered him, contrary to habit, to leave the side gate unlatched in case of an evening delivery. He thought this odd, for she seldom permitted tradesmen past the front steps. "Delivery of what?" asked Whimsy with bright eagerness. "She never said, my lord, and nothing came, far as I know." "Yet the gate was open when you left it?" "Wide open, sir. I locked it again after finding the commotion." At this, Whimsy leaned back in his chair, balancing his teacup with a care that made the gesture seem almost insolent. "You see, my dear constable," he observed, "we have a corpse where it should not be, a piano that resents being overlooked, curtains drawn contrary to habit, and a gate that stands ajar in expectation of a delivery which never materialized." Positively a comedy of manners, though the denouement is, I fear, a trifle grim. The constable muttered about waiting for the doctor. Whimsy, with airy unconcern, agreed, though his eyes had fixed again upon the blank sheet of music. He lifted it delicately, noted the absence of any penciled notations, and replaced it with exaggerated reverence. By now the body had been covered, but the impression of its posture upon the instrument lingered in every glance cast toward it. Whimsy rose, moved lightly to the window, and inspected the sill. A faint smear, perhaps of mud or grease, marked the wood. He touched it with his gloved finger, then wiped it absent-mindedly upon his handkerchief. "Curious," he murmured. "One expects dust, perhaps, but not grease. Grease implies machinery. Machinery implies either a tradesman or, how shall I put it, a gentleman of the mechanical persuasion." He turned, all politeness once more. "Well, my friends, I shall not detain you further tonight. Bunter, we shall arrange our lodging. I fancy we shall remain in Ashcombe for a few days, if the vicar will be so good as to recommend an inn with tolerable sheets and an absence of bagpipes." The vicar spluttered something about the Crown and Anchor, which satisfied Whimsy immensely. He made his bow to the company, even to the constable, and as he passed out of the room, he tapped the piano lid lightly with his cane. The hollow sound, oddly resonant, drew his attention for a final moment. "Funny thing about pianos," he remarked. "They have a way of speaking only when least desired. I wonder what this one has been trying so hard not to say." And with that, he departed into the corridor, leaving behind the uneasy hush of a house suddenly too aware of its silences. The following morning dawned with a faint drizzle, the sort of uninspired weather that seemed designed to dampen both collars and spirits without ever quite achieving the dignity of a storm. Lord Peter Whimsy, however, appeared to take it as a personal compliment. At breakfast in the Crown and Anchor he discoursed amiably upon the various gradations of English rain, how it might be classified not merely as drizzle, shower, or downpour, but as melancholic, superfluous, or deliberately obtuse. Bunter, who had learned long ago that his master's nonsense often served as the prelude to some exceedingly pointed observation, confined himself to buttering toast with military precision. By mid-morning, Whimsy had arranged to meet Inspector Grantley, a large and amiable man with a fondness for the word obvious. They gathered once again at Ashcombe Rectory, where the body of Miss Honoria Fletch had been conveyed to an upstairs chamber, pending the coroner's arrival. The drawing-room was empty save for the piano, which seemed somehow more accusatory in daylight, as though reproaching the company for making it an accessory to melodrama. Grantley cleared his throat, which seemed to serve him both as an introduction and as punctuation. "Well, my lord, I fancy this won't trouble us much. The doctors put it down to heart seizure, very sudden but not unusual at her age. Naturally, we'll have to make a proper inquiry, but I shouldn't think the jury will be long about it." Whimsy's monocle flashed as he regarded the inspector. "Ah, the blessed phrase not unusual," he said. Most comfortable conclusion, my dear man, but do let me be the fly in the ointment. Wouldn't you say, Bunter, that dying in a theatrical posture across a piano is a trifle unusual, at least in Ashcombe society?" "Highly unusual, my lord," replied Bunter gravely. Grantley grunted. "Perhaps, but the circumstances are clear enough. If there is any doubt, we've a likely explanation already to hand." Whimsy raised an eyebrow. "A likely explanation? You make it sound like a novel by Mrs. Radcliffe. Pray enlighten me." The inspector shifted his weight. "Her nephew, Sir Lionel Fletch. He's heir to most of her estate, barring certain odd properties she was holding on to. They've not been on speaking terms these 10 years, since he accused her of mismanaging his father's legacy. but he was seen here in the village yesterday afternoon. Arrived from London in a motor car, bold as brass. Several people witnessed him at the post office, and by evening the old lady was dead. You can see the conclusion." "Indeed," said Whimsy lightly. "One can always see a conclusion when it is written in letters large enough to cover the cathedral tower. The difficulty, my dear Inspector, is that the obvious conclusion has an irritating habit of being false. Still, do go on." Grantley frowned but pressed forward. "Sir Lionel's up to his neck in debt from what we hear. Horses, women, some dabbling in shares, none of it paying. If Miss Fletch had been persuaded to alter her will in his favour, or even to release those Tilbury warehouses, he'd have a fortune. Instead, she refused, and he lost his temper. A quarrel, perhaps a struggle, and she fell. Heart gave out, or worse. We'll see." The inspector spoke with such conviction that the servants, gathered anxiously in the hall, exchanged glances of grim satisfaction. There is always comfort in an obvious villain, particularly when he lives at a distance and wears too much scent. Whimsy, however, strolled to the window and peered out at the dripping garden with apparent indifference. "You interest me enormously," he murmured. "Tell me, when was Sir Lionel seen at the post office?" "Shortly before 4, replied Grantley. "Mrs. Clay, the postmistress, is certain of it. He was sending a telegram. She read part of the address by mistake, something in London." "And Miss Fletch dined at 7? Her death, we suppose, occurred somewhere between 7:30 and 8, when the housemaid returned to the drawing-room?" "Exactly so." "Then, unless the laws of physics have been revised overnight, Sir Lionel had 3 good hours in which to quarrel, strangle, or otherwise inconvenience his aunt. Very dashing of him." Whimsy turned from the window, his eyes alight with mischief. "What a splendid red herring he makes! But do forgive me, I run ahead of the evidence." Grantley's colour deepened, though whether from irritation or damp was difficult to say. "You can
call it what you like, my lord, but the man had both motive and opportunity. We shall be questioning him at once." "Capital," said Whimsy cheerfully. "Do allow me to be present. There is nothing more educational than watching an intelligent man attempt to appear innocent, or indeed a guilty man attempt to appear intelligent." The inspector muttered but acquiesced. A message was sent, and by afternoon Sir Lionel Fletch arrived at the rectory in his motor, trailing an expensive overcoat and a faint odour of tobacco. He was a tall, handsome fellow, but with that peculiar slackness about the mouth that suggested an inclination towards self-pity. He greeted the company with brusque civility, accepted a cigarette from his case, and waited for the accusations to begin. Grantley did not disappoint. He laid out the facts with relish, the inheritance, the debts, the visit to the village, and the convenient timing of Miss Fletch's death. Sir Lionel listened, smoked, and finally laughed in the careless manner of one accustomed to parry creditors with wit rather than cash. "My dear Inspector," he said, "you make me out a melodramatic villain. Yes, I was here. Yes, I spoke with my aunt. No, she did not so much as raise her voice. She was in excellent health when I left her, save for the usual acerbities of temper. If she died an hour later, it was nature's doing, not mine." "Nature's doing rarely contrives to seat the deceased in so dramatic a posture," observed Whimsy, mildly. Sir Lionel regarded him with faint contempt. "Ah, Lord Peter, I've heard of your little adventures. Always some absurd clue about a candle guttering or a cat sneezing, isn't it? I'm afraid I disappoint you. I left the house at 5 o'clock, drove straight back to town, and was at my club by 7. Plenty of people saw me there." Grantley looked triumphant, as though alibis were mere trifles. "Clubs are no proof, Sir Lionel. Half the rogues in London can conjure a club witness. Still, we'll look into it." Whimsy, however, seemed enchanted. "A motor car at 5 o'clock from Ashcombe to London, in rain such as this. One might scrape it in 2 hours, perhaps less, if one valued life at a discount. Admirable energy, what?" He studied Lionel as though he were a peculiar insect pinned under glass. "Tell me, did you notice whether the piano was open or shut when you departed?" "The piano?" Lionel blinked. "I haven't the faintest idea. I never gave it a thought." "Precisely. That, you see, is what makes it so interesting." Lionel exhaled smoke with exasperation. "If this is the level of inquiry, I shall leave you to it." Grantley warned him not to go far, and Lionel departed in a cloud of cologne. The servants watched with satisfaction, convinced justice was imminent. When the house was quieter, Whimsy turned to Bunter. "Well, what do you think?" "That he is an obvious red herring, my lord," replied Bunter, "laid on with a trowel." "Exactly. When the fish smells too strongly, one suspects the cook." Whimsy smiled, lit another cigarette, and wandered once more to the piano. His gloved fingers rested upon the silent keys, and he whispered, as though to himself, "The piano no one played, except perhaps for one fatal note." He straightened, brisk again. "Come, Bunter, let us inspect those Tilbury warehouses. They may prove more melodious than this instrument of silence." And with that he swept from the room, leaving Inspector Grantley to wonder, not for the first time, whether Lord Peter's levity concealed madness or genius. Lord Peter Wimsey's interest in curtains, carpets, and other household trivia was, to Inspector Grantley's mind, the surest evidence that the man had entirely lost his tether. Yet there he was, returning to Ashcombe Rectory the following day, not with handcuffs or solemn warrants, but with a notebook in which he scrawled remarks about draughts, bell ringers, and the precise quality of the dust upon a pianoforte lid. The house itself seemed more watchful now, the blinds lowered, the servants tiptoeing about with the careful zeal of people who feel themselves unjustly suspected. Whimsy entered as though attending a matinee performance. He carried with him a small magnifying glass and a tape measure, which he flourished with an air of apology, as though it were a child's toy he had borrowed without permission. "Good morning, Inspector," he said with a bow. "I propose, if you do not object, to ask the house a few questions. Not the people, mind you, tiresome creatures forever contradicting themselves, but the house. Bricks and boards do not lie. They may, however, sulk, and one must coax them." Grantley gave a grunt of weary resignation. "If you can get sense out of furniture, my lord, you'll be the first." "Not at all," Whimsy replied cheerfully. "I once had a most illuminating conversation with a fire grate in Battersea, but let us begin." He strode to the drawing-room. The piano waited, stolid and mute, beneath its dust-cloth. Whimsy removed the cloth, ran his hand along the lid, and then crouched to study the pedals. He pressed each in turn, listening to the creak. Odd, perfectly sound, no hint of neglect. Yet the room smells faintly of polish. "Bunter, do be a good fellow. Has this instrument been tampered with in the last week?" Bunter knelt with soldierly care, inspected the screws, and pronounced that the pedals had indeed been removed and replaced not more than a few days past. The brass bore fresh scratches, and the surrounding carpet showed the faint drag marks of furniture, shifted and then put back again. "Quite so," said Whimsy. "Someone has been playing with our piano in a manner more mechanical than musical, and then there is the matter of the curtains. These were open last night." "Normally shut, we are told. Look at the fabric, Inspector, the fading along the edge suggests years of dutiful closure at dusk. Only yesterday evening did they gape like guilty lips." Grantley snorted. "Curtains don't kill people." "No, but they admit visitors," Whimsy returned. And as for carpets, observe here the impression of a chair in the pile just beside the window. It has been moved recently, though not replaced. Now, why would one shift a chair there unless one wished to watch or be seen from outside? The inspector's irritation deepened. "You're chasing shadows, my lord." "Shadows are remarkably useful things," Whimsy countered lightly. "They tell one where the light has been." He moved next to the mantelpiece. A candlestick gleamed there, its base smeared with wax that had hardened in peculiar rivulets. Whimsy sniffed delicately. "Bayberry, not the sort of candle Miss Fletch would have kept, I fancy. Too fashionable. She preferred the plain church taper. And yet here we have a new wax, with its own scent. Imported, I should wager. Bunter, make a note." The constable shuffled, clearly impatient, but Whimsy pressed on, bending now to the carpet near the piano. He pulled from the pile a single white thread, caught where the piano leg met the rug. He examined it with interest. Cotton, perhaps, torn from a glove. One does not play at mechanics without dirtying the fingers, and one does not like dirt upon gloves. Grantley's patience finally broke. "See here, my lord, what do curtains, carpets, and candles matter when we have a nephew with debts and a quarrel? It's plain enough." Whimsy replaced his monocle, looking mildly hurt. "Plainness, my dear Inspector, is the most suspicious thing in the world. Life, like art, thrives upon complexity. When you see a picture in which every brushstroke is obvious, you may be sure the artist has concealed his true design beneath the varnish. Let us not be outwitted by varnish." At that moment, Pritchard the butler lumbered into the room. His expression, never pleasant, had settled into active hostility. "Beg pardon, my lord, but some of us has duties to attend, and the poking about of strangers makes it difficult to maintain the house." Whimsy turned upon him with sudden sharpness. "Indeed, Pritchard, and whose duty was it to wind the hall clock?" The butler blinked. "Mine, sir. I wind it every Saturday." "Curious," Whimsy said softly, "because it stands now at 20 minutes slow, though I distinctly heard it strike in accord with the church bell last night. Either your memory fails you, or someone has been tampering with time itself. Which is it to be?" The butler flushed, but made no reply. Whimsy smiled, all charm again, and waved him away. "Pray do not trouble yourself further, Mr. Pritchard. We all have our clocks to wind." When he was gone, Grantley muttered, "You frightened the man for no reason." "On the contrary," said Whimsy, "I merely asked whether he had kept his duty. He preferred to say nothing. Silence, Inspector, is often the loudest confession." They moved to the hall, where Whimsy paused to inspect the umbrella stand. One umbrella bore mud stains quite unlike the garden soil, darker and more oily. Whimsy sniffed the tip and raised his brows. "Not Ashcombe earth. Dockside, I should say. And yet who among this household has visited Tilbury recently?" Grantley groaned. "We'll be here all day if you keep sniffing umbrellas." "Then our time will be profitably spent," Whimsy said with equanimity. "Do consider a piano dismantled, a chair shifted, curtains unlatched, a clock adjusted, a candle replaced, and an umbrella smeared with foreign soil. Each detail trifling in itself, but together they form a sonata of deceit. Someone played this house as though it were an instrument, and Miss Fletch was made to be the final chord." He smiled, pleased with his metaphor, and scribbled in his notebook. The afternoon passed in further examinations, most of which seemed to the inspector no more than folly. Whimsy measured the distance from the window to the gate, calculated how long it would take a man to cross the garden unseen, and asked each servant with maddening courtesy what precise hour they wound their watches. He even inquired of the vicar's wife what brand of polish she recommended for woodwork, and when she replied beeswax, of course, He nodded as though she had confirmed the very pivot of the case. By the time they departed, Grantley was muttering about wasted effort, but Wimsey looked serene. As they stepped into the wet evening, he said, "My dear Inspector, you remind me of a man who insists upon reading the last page of a novel first. It deprives one of the exquisite pleasure of the middle. Trust me, the middle is where the devil always lurks." Grantley asked what he had discovered. Wimsey tapped his nose. "Nothing but irrelevancies. And irrelevancies, you know, are the very stuff of truth, for the truth is never straightforward. It always has curtains, carpets, clocks, and candles trailing behind it like the tail of a comet." With that, he turned up his collar against the drizzle, whistling a bar from Mozart as though nothing could delight him more than a murder wrapped in domestic trivia. Rain had thickened to a thin grey veil the next morning, clinging to the hedgerows and church tower, until the village looked like a watercolour that had been carelessly smudged. Wimsey, unfazed, treated the damp as though it were a stage effect set in place expressly for his amusement. He had already sent Bunter out on small errands, timing the distance from the Crown and Anchor to the rectory gate, consulting the postmistress about her clocks, and inquiring discreetly at the stables about the reliability of Sir Lionel's motor car. By the time Inspector Grantley joined him, somewhat grumpily fortified with bacon and tea, Wimsey was pacing the inn's parlour, tapping his cane upon the floorboards like a conductor testing acoustics. "Ah, Inspector," he said, "today we concern ourselves with the most tedious and therefore most indispensable aspect of all crime, chronology. For murderers, like playwrights, must always get their cues correct. If the curtain rises before they are ready, the comedy collapses." Grantley sighed. "I suppose you've already a theory?" "Merely a suspicion that time has been badly mismanaged in this household. Let us reconstruct step by step." And so, notebook in hand, Wimsey began to map the day of Miss Fletcher's death with pedantic care. At 3 o'clock, she had been observed by Elsie in her sitting-room, quarrelling with her solicitor by letter. At 4, Sir Lionel was seen at the post-office, sending a telegram. Shortly thereafter, he visited his aunt, departing about 5. Supper was served at 7, cleared by past. By 8, Miss Fletch was discovered dead upon the piano. "Neat enough," said Grantley. "He quarrelled, she collapsed, end of play." "Not so fast," said Wimsey. "Bunter, the Times?" Bunter, as dependable as a metronome, consulted his notes. "From Ashcombe to London by motor car, even in unfavourable weather, requires 2 hours and a quarter, my lord, assuming one drives briskly but avoids notice. If Sir Lionel departed at 5, he could indeed have reached his club by 7:30, as claimed. His alibi, though not unshakable, is not impossible." "Precisely," said Wimsey. "But consider this. Miss Fletcher's clock in the hall is 20 minutes slow. When Elsie thought she cleared supper at 7:30, it may, in fact, have been nearer to 10 minutes, to 8. Thus the window for death narrows or shifts altogether. One must never trust clocks. They are the most amiable liars." Grantley grunted. "Even so, the time is close enough." "Close enough to deceive, yes, but not close enough to satisfy me." They went again to the rectory. Wimsey insisted upon repeating every step of the evening. Elsie carried in a tray at precisely 7, placed it upon the sideboard, and departed. Wimsey noted the creak of the door hinges, the slow tick of the hall clock, and the faint chime of the church bell outside. He had Bunter sit in the scullery while he himself struck the piano keys in the drawing-room, proving that no sound carried down the passage when the scullery door was shut. "You see," he said to Grantley, "a person might have played or tampered here without the servants hearing a note. Silence is very obliging if you shut the right doors." Pritchard, the butler, summoned reluctantly, confirmed he had been in the pantry, polishing silver until 8. The gardener was in the sheds oiling his tools. Each had their little alibi. Too little, thought Whimsy, for alibis that are too convenient invite distrust. At Whimsy's direction, Bunter performed an experiment. He seated himself at the piano while Whimsy stood outside in the garden by the unlatched window. With the curtains open, a flicker of movement was visible in the lamplight. With the curtains closed, nothing at all. "Now, Inspector," Whimsy said with relish, "imagine you are a person waiting in the shrubbery. You see the curtains open, a lady seated at her table, perhaps rising to draw near the instrument. You wait, you watch, and then, poof, she collapses. You have only to slip through the gate, across the grass, and be gone again." Grantley shook his head. "And risk being seen by half the village? No, no, far easier for the nephew." "Perhaps, but we must not overlook the piano itself. Consider, why should Miss Fletch die upon an instrument she loathed? A chair stood by the window, remember. Someone sat there. She rose, perhaps irritated, perhaps goaded, and found herself upon the piano, not natural, not accidental, arranged. They proceeded to the hall, where Whimsy fussed over the slow clock. He removed the glass, set the hands aright, then reset them 20 minutes back again. "There! Now we can see how convenient it is. By tampering with this trifling mechanism, one can alter the narrative of a whole evening. Suppose Miss Fletch died nearer to 8:30. Then Sir Lionel is safe in London, and someone nearer at hand must answer. Suppose, on the contrary, she died before 7:30. Then the servants' movements no longer provide them cover. Each possibility rearranges the cast like pawns on a chessboard." Grantley muttered darkly, but even he could not deny the logic. At Whimsy's request, the village bell-ringer was called in, a jovial fellow with hands like hams. He confirmed that the church bell was kept in excellent order, chiming exactly on the quarter. He even recalled that at 7 o'clock it had struck unusually loud, for a new clapper had been installed that very week. "There, Inspector!" Whimsy cried triumphantly. "A clock that lies, a bell that tells the truth. What could be more delightful? Miss Fletch herself remarked upon the bell that evening. Did she not, Elsie? She claimed it rang off key. Ergo she was alive to hear it at 7. If she was dead by 8, our window is narrow indeed. Who among us can act with such neat timing? Not a hot-headed nephew, storming off in his motor. No, someone nearer, someone practised." The servants shifted uneasily. Pritchard glared. Elsie twisted her apron. Whimsy turned abruptly to the vicar. "Pray, sir, when did you last call upon Miss Fletch?" The vicar, startled, stammered that he had spoken with her only 2 days earlier about the restoration fund for St. Mildred's roof. She had been unusually generous, pledging a small donation. Whimsy nodded thoughtfully. "Ah, yes, a promise for the future. And now the future has been curtailed. Promises are most awkward things when one intends to depart this world." The reconstruction continued with almost farcical precision. Whimsy had the maid carry the tray in. Again had Pritchard shift the chair to its impression on the carpet. Had Bunter wind the hall clock 20 minutes slow. He timed the walk from scullery to drawing-room, the journey from rectory gate to window, the sound of footsteps upon the gravel path. At each stage he noted inconsistencies. "Observe, Inspector, if Sir Lionel left at 5, he cannot have tampered with the hall clock afterward. It was wound last Saturday by Pritchard. And yet it is Slow now who adjusted it, not Lionel, someone here. If Miss Fletch expected a delivery through the side gate, why was none recorded? Who knew she would be at the piano precisely then? Only those within the house could arrange such stagecraft." Grantley at last grew uneasy. "Then you suggest what? That the servants plotted it?" Whimsy only smiled. "My dear fellow, I suggest nothing. I merely tidy up the minutes, as any good secretary might. Once we know where every tick and tock belongs, the murderer will appear in his proper place, rather like a badly written character who wanders on stage at the wrong moment. The inspector muttered something about play acting, but there was no denying that Wimsey's reconstruction had introduced a troubling uncertainty. The obvious solution now looked just a shade too simple, and the village's comfortable conviction of Sir Lionel's guilt began to wobble. As they departed the rectory, Wimsey paused once more by the silent piano, laying his hand upon the lid with mock affection. "Poor creature," he said softly, "made to play a part it never desired. But you and I shall yet have a word together, for every piano, even one no one played, has its own peculiar note, and I fancy this one may yet strike it." And with that, he followed Bunter into the rain, leaving the house heavy with the sense that time itself had been rearranged under his fingers. The drizzle had lifted into a thin, pearly light the following morning, casting Ashcombe in the pallid glow of a landscape awaiting confession. Wimsey, in his usual air of amused indolence, had spent the early hours not in the rectory but in the village library, leafing through parish registers with the enthusiasm of a man reading the scandal pages of a newspaper. Bunter, immaculate even in provincial gloom, stood by with a notebook, making precise copies of births, deaths, and marriages. When Inspector Grantley finally tracked them down among the dust and bindings, Wimsey looked up with an expression of delight that would have been more appropriate to a schoolboy discovering a box of fireworks. "My dear Inspector, do observe, Ashcombe is a veritable treasure trove of family duplicity. Our late Miss Fletch, it seems, was not merely the maiden aunt she pretended to be." "Oh no, she had a most diverting past." Grantley's eyes narrowed. "What nonsense are you after now?" "No nonsense at all," replied Wimsey, airily. "Simply that our dear Honoria was once married, briefly, discreetly, and to a man who died, or vanished, under circumstances none too clear. The record here lists a marriage 30 years ago to one Richard Paxton, a shipping clerk from Tilbury. Within 5 years, Paxton is noted as deceased, but there is no grave in Ashcombe and no notice in the London papers. Curious, don't you think?" Bunter, ever efficient, produced a copy of the entry. Grantley frowned at it, unwilling to admit interest but unable to dismiss the possibility. "And what of it? People marry, people die." "Indeed," said Wimsey, "but consider the Tilbury warehouses. They were not part of the Fletch estate originally, yet Miss Fletch held them in her own right. I fancy they were a legacy from Mr. Paxton, and a widow who inherits unexpectedly may prefer to let the village suppose she was never a wife at all. It avoids awkward questions." Grantley scratched his chin. "Still doesn't prove murder." "No," Wimsey agreed cheerfully, "but it gives us motive. Suppose Richard Paxton did not die but merely disappeared. Suppose Miss Fletch, under another name, had obligations she wished concealed. Suppose someone connected with that past appeared last week at her door. Say a gentleman from London asking about property. And suppose she refused him, fearing exposure. That, Inspector, would be enough to rattle any heart, weak or otherwise." The inspector shifted uneasily. "You're telling me the woman led a double life?" "I am telling you," said Wimsey, tapping his cane against the floor for emphasis, "that everyone leads at least 2 lives, one they show to the neighbours and one they conduct in private. Occasionally there is even a third, reserved for the law courts. Our Miss Fletch, I suspect, had at least 2, and it is the second that killed her." To confirm his suspicion, Wimsey insisted they call again upon Pritchard the butler. The man shuffled in with his habitual surly air, clearly disliking the intrusion. Wimsey greeted him with exaggerated politeness. "Mr. Pritchard, you were with Miss Fletch for many years, were you not? Did she ever receive letters addressed to another name?" The butler shifted, uncomfortable. Now and again, sir. Old correspondence. She told me never to mention it. Said it was family business. Ah, family business, the most fatal of all. And you obeyed her? Course I did. And never thought it odd that her bank accounts bore not only the Fletch name, but occasionally the initials H.P. The butler's mouth twitched. If I did, I kept it to myself. Very wise, said Whimsy, pleasantly. Though not perhaps wise enough. Pritchard blanched, muttered something about polishing the silver, and withdrew. Grantley stared after him. You see, Whimsy said softly. The household knew, they always know, but silence is more convenient than scandal. Later that afternoon, Bunter returned from Tilbury with further intelligence. Paxton, it seemed, had been involved in a small shipping concern that dealt with exotic imports, spices, oils, and occasionally items not entirely legal. Rumours of smuggling had dogged him. His disappearance had been noted in dockside gossip, but never pursued. So, said Whimsy, lounging back in his chair at the inn, we have Miss Fletch, who reinvented herself as a respectable spinster, and behind her a husband whose dealings were shady enough to leave a residue of suspicion upon her fortune. For years she concealed it. Then someone comes asking questions, someone who knows the Paxton name. The piano no one played becomes the stage for the final act. Grantley muttered about melodrama, but his conviction in Sir Lionel's guilt was beginning to falter. You mean to say this mysterious visitor killed her? Perhaps, said Whimsy. Or perhaps she killed herself in fear, or perhaps someone nearer, knowing of her secret, used it as leverage. The point is that her life was not as it seemed, and when a life is double, its end is rarely single. The next day brought a further twist. A letter, found tucked behind a drawer in Miss Fletcher's desk, bore the signature R. Paxton. It was dated only a month past, and written in a hand more vigorous than that of a man 30 years dead should possess. The letter was short, almost curt. You have hidden long enough. I will come to you. The warehouses must be restored to my name. Prepare yourself. Whimsy read it aloud, his voice almost gleeful. There! Proof that our ghost was still alive. The husband returns. Imagine the shock, the horror, the calculation. No wonder she seemed in spirits that evening. Perhaps she believed she had resolved it, or perhaps she realized the trap was closing. Grantley stared. If this Paxton fellow came back, he had every reason to threaten her. Why not kill her outright? Whimsy held up the letter delicately. Because, Inspector, threats are often more effective than action, unless, of course, she resisted. Then, well, a shove, a grasp at the chest, and Our Lady's across the piano. But tell me, does this letter not disturb the neatness of your nephew theory? It did. The household, questioned again, grew uneasy. Elsie insisted she had seen a tall man near the gate 2 nights before, though she had dismissed it as imagination. Hobbs, the gardener, swore he had heard unfamiliar footsteps on the gravel, too light to be Sir Lionel's stride. Pritchard muttered that strangers were always about, and grew red when pressed further. Bit by bit, the figure of Richard Paxton began to loom over the narrative like a ghost from melodrama. Yet Whimsy, though apparently delighted, never quite committed himself to declaring Paxton the culprit. Instead, he asked Bunter peculiar questions. How long it took to travel from Tilbury to Ashcombe, how often the dockside trains ran, how one might send a telegram without giving one's true address. At last, as they stood once more in the rectory drawing-room, Whimsy placed his hand upon the piano lid and murmured, "The double life, Inspector, is like a double note upon a keyboard. At first you hear one sound, then the harmony reveals itself." Miss Fletch was Honoria to the village, Paxton's widow to the law, and perhaps something more besides. It was not only a life she lived in duplicate, but a death as well. For while the village believes she died of her heart, we may yet find that her heart was merely the instrument, and another hand struck the chord. Grantley muttered darkly that Whimsy spoke in riddles. Whimsy only smiled, adjusted his monocle, and declared that the real amusement lay ahead. For once a double life is uncovered, he said. One must ask not merely who killed, but which identity was meant to die. And with that he closed his notebook, leaving the rectory in a hush thick enough to hear the ticking of the unreliable hall clock, 20 minutes behind the truth, just as Miss Fletch herself had been. The weather in Ashcombe shifted again, as though it too grew restless under the strain of unanswered questions. A pale sun broke through, catching the roofs and hedges with a brittle clarity, and yet the rectory itself seemed sunk in shadow. Whimsy, who thrived on such atmospherics as though they were stage lighting, declared it the perfect day for contradictions. "Truth, my dear Inspector," he told Grantley as they entered the drawing-room once more, "is never an isolated object. It is a tapestry. One must tug at loose threads, and behold, a pattern emerges where none seemed to exist." The servants were assembled for another round of questioning, each looking more exhausted than the last. Pritchard stood with folded arms, defiance written in every line of his jowly face. Elsie, pale and anxious, twisted her apron. Hobbs loitered near the door, hat in hand. Even the vicar hovered, his piety tested by the repeated desecration of decorum. It began innocuously enough. Whimsy, with an air of distraction, asked Elsie once again to recount the moment she had found her mistress. She faltered, repeated the same words: the door ajar, the body on the piano, her scream, her flight to the vicar. "Yes, yes," Whimsy said kindly. "But tell me, when you first opened the door, what did you notice before you saw her, before the shock? A sound, a smell, anything trifling?" Elsie wrung her hands. "Only, well, the window was open. I thought I felt the draught, and there was wax, sir, on the carpet. I near slipped on it. I didn't say before because it seemed foolish." Whimsy's eyes lit up. "Wax on the carpet? Where?" "Near the foot of the piano, sir. Just a little lump." "Ah!" He leaned down, examined the carpet with Bunter's help, and presently produced a faint trace, hardened and brittle, that had escaped the earlier cleaning. "My dear child, you have rescued the case from monotony. Wax, you see, has no business upon a carpet unless someone has been clumsy with a candle, and clumsy candles are rarely innocent." Inspector Grantley grumbled. "What does it prove? Someone knocked over a candlestick." "Indeed," said Whimsy cheerfully. "But recall, the candlestick upon the mantel held bayberry wax, recently burned. Not Miss Fletcher's taste. Now we learn that some of that wax fell to the carpet precisely where her body lay. Therefore, whoever handled that candle was near the piano at the crucial moment." Pritchard shifted uneasily. Whimsy, with feigned innocence, turned to him. "You were polishing silver that night, I believe. Did you require a candle for the task?" "No, sir," Pritchard muttered. "Electric lamp in the pantry." "Quite so. Then someone else provided illumination where none was wanted." He turned suddenly to Hobbs. "And you, my good man, did you notice a light in this room from the garden?" The gardener scratched his head. "Now you mention it, sir, I did see a flicker when I was locking the shed. Thought it queer, seeing as the curtains was usually drawn." "Excellent," cried Whimsy. "The wax upon the carpet, the curtain drawn back, the window unlatched, each detail worthless alone, but together a confession." The room grew tense. Grantley scowled. "Confession of what?" "That our culprit, whoever he or she may be, set the stage deliberately. They brought in a candle, they opened the curtains, They moved the chair, they tampered with the clock. It was theatre, Inspector, a perfectly rehearsed performance. At this, Elsie burst out with a nervous protest. "But it's never let no one move her furniture." "Precisely," said Whimsy. "Which means she did not move it herself. It was moved for her." Bunter, silent until now, stepped forward with a small envelope he had retrieved from the desk earlier. "My lord, I discovered this among some discarded bills. It contains a receipt from a chemist in Tilbury. Bayberry candles, purchased a fortnight ago." "Splendid," Whimsy declared. "And not in Miss Fletcher's hand, I'll wager. Pritchard, would you be so good as to compare the script?" The butler's face grew blotchy. "I know nothing about it." Whimsy smiled thinly. "Then someone in this house does, for why should a woman who detests music, Twilight and company suddenly acquire scented candles from Tilbury? Unless someone else wished to mask a smell or create an impression." Grantley seized on the point. "Mask a smell? What smell?" "Oil, perhaps," Whimsy said softly. "Or machinery. Recall the grease upon the window-sill. Put them together, grease, candle, chair, curtains. Someone was waiting, not for music, but for a signal." The company muttered, alarmed. Whimsy pressed on. "Elsie, you said you nearly slipped on the wax. Did you also notice whether the piano lid was open or shut?" "Shut, sir. Always shut." "Ah," he clapped his hands. "Then a collapse. Across it was all the more theatrical. She did not fall upon an open keyboard in mid-song. She was placed deliberately upon a shut lid, with a candle burning near enough to drip." The inspector frowned. "Placed? You mean she was dead already?" Whimsy gave a delicate shrug. "Perhaps dead, perhaps insensible, but certainly arranged. A tableau vivant. Murderers, like bad artists, cannot resist composition." There was a stir among the servants. Pritchard scowled, Elsie looked terrified, and Hobbs muttered that he wanted no part of such goings-on. The vicar, pale, asked, "But why? Why pose her so grotesquely?" "Because," Whimsy answered gravely, "our culprit wished to mislead us into believing her death a sudden, natural seizure, nothing so persuasive as a dramatic collapse. But in arranging the scene, they left crumbs, the wax, the clock, the curtain, each trivial, each damning." At this point, the constable entered with a message. A stranger had been seen in the village the previous week, tall, with a scar across his cheek. He had asked after the rectory, then vanished. Whimsy received this with unholy glee. "Paxton, of course, our revenant from Tilbury. He came, he threatened, perhaps he demanded. Whether he killed or whether another seized the opportunity remains to be seen, but his shadow falls across every detail. And note, the candle, purchased in Tilbury. The warehouses held in Miss Fletcher's name. The letter signed R. Paxton. A double life now colliding with a single death." The inspector muttered something about finally having a lead. Whimsy, however, seemed to drift into abstraction, pacing the room, fingers tapping the piano lid. At last he murmured, "The twist, Inspector, lies not in the obvious suspect, but in the overlooked detail. Wax upon a carpet dismissed by a maid. A triviality, yet it unravels the whole illusion. When testimony contradicts itself, we must listen to the smaller voice." He turned abruptly to Pritchard. "Tell me, when did you last oil the hinges of that window?" The butler blinked. "Never, sir. They've been stiff for years." "Indeed? Yet they moved last night without a squeak." "Someone oiled them. Someone prepared." Silence fell. The household seemed caught in its own web. Whimsy adjusted his monocle, smiled without warmth, and said quietly, "There, Inspector. We have our twist. Miss Fletcher's death was no accident of the heart nor an impulsive quarrel. It was staged, rehearsed, and executed with props. Someone played this house like an instrument, striking false notes to mislead us, and sooner or later They shall play one note too many." With that he closed his notebook, leaving the servants trembling and Inspector Grantley muttering about damned riddles. But Whimsy, stepping out into the brittle sunlight, felt the thrill of pursuit keen upon him. For the twist in testimony had come, as it always did, not from loud declarations, but from the whisper of wax upon a carpet. The evening chosen for Whimsy's little pageant was clear and sharp, the rain finally having exhausted itself. A pale moon hung over Ashcombe like a lamp hung too low in a theatre, and Whimsy, who had insisted the entire company assemble in the rectory drawing-room once more, seemed positively giddy at the prospect. "It is all theatre, Inspector," he remarked as he lit a cigarette, his profile sharp against the lamplight. "One cannot hope to understand the business of murder unless one appreciates the art of stage management. Consider, our victim posed across a piano she detested, curtains opened against her habit, a candle burning when none was needed. The play was set for us, badly acted, badly directed. Tonight we attempt a revival with better casting." Inspector Grantley, sour and suspicious, muttered that he disliked parlour tricks. Whimsy waved him off. "My dear fellow, a reconstruction is the only honest method. If we wish to know how Miss Fletch was made to die, we must place ourselves where she stood and where her murderer waited." The household, clearly resentful, gathered under protest. Pritchard the butler glowered. Elsie trembled. Hobbs muttered to himself and eyed the window as though considering escape. Even the vicar, drawn against his will into the scene, shifted uneasily among the chairs. Whimsy positioned them with the care of a stage director. "Elsie, you are to carry in the supper tray as you did that night. Pritchard, kindly stand where you claim to have been polishing the silver. Hobbs at the shed door. Inspector, you shall do me the honour of occupying the scullery. I shall take the role of our lamented Miss Fletch, and Bunter will provide lighting." He seated himself primly at the small table near the window, an air of absurd solemnity upon his face. The tray was brought in, placed, and removed. Whimsy rose, moved toward the piano, and with exaggerated grace collapsed across it. "Observe," he said, peering up from the polished wood, "how very silly it looks. One does not expire thus without assistance. Now, Bunter, the candle." Bunter lit a bayberry candle and placed it upon the mantel. The wax dripped, catching the lamplight. Whimsy pointed. "There, already we have our wax upon the carpet. Already the illusion begins. But the curtains? Ah, that is the crux." He had Elsie draw them back. Moonlight filtered in, faint but definite. He motioned to Hobbs, who stood reluctantly by the window. "Tell us, Hobbs, do you see me?" "Aye, sir," Hobbs muttered. "Plain as day." "Precisely. The murderer needed witnesses, though none realized it. A shadow at the window would prove Miss Fletch alive at 7, but in truth it may have been anyone posed in her stead. Curtain open, candle burning, enough to trick a gardener's eye." There was a murmur of astonishment. Grantley began to object, but Whimsy raised a hand. "Patience, Inspector. The act is not finished. Consider the hall clock, 20 minutes slow. At what we believe to be 7:30, it was in fact nearly 8. A convenient shift, narrowing or widening alibis as desired. Pritchard, when you wound the clock last Saturday, did you not notice it slowing?" Pritchard flushed. "I wound it proper. Someone else meddled with it." "Quite so," Whimsy said softly. "Someone did. And that someone is here tonight." The servants gasped. Whimsy straightened, his face suddenly sharpened of all levity. "We now come to the piano itself. Tampered with days before, its pedals unscrewed, its frame shifted slightly. Why? Not for music, for mechanics. Someone used the piano as a stage prop, arranging it so that when Miss Fletch fell or was placed, her death seemed natural, theatrical, and above all, unassailable. But in their eagerness, they forgot that houses, like actors, revealed the truth in trifles, a smear of grease, a lump of wax, a clock's deceit. Grantley, visibly unsettled, muttered, "You mean to name the culprit here and now?" Wimsey gave him a look of mock innocence. "Why, Inspector, what better stage? We have our audience, our cast, our props. It only remains to cue the final act." At that moment, Bunter, who had been standing quietly by, extinguished the lamp at Wimsey's signal, leaving only the candle and moonlight. The room filled with shadow, and every face appeared grotesque, half revealed. Wimsey's voice floated out, soft and deliberate. On that night, someone entered by the unlatched gate, oiled the stiff window hinges, and placed themselves in this very room. They opened the curtains, lit the bayberry candle, and arranged the chair to give the illusion of Miss Fletch at her vigil. When she arrived, perhaps summoned, perhaps forced, they struck. A struggle, a hand at the chest, and she collapsed. Her body was laid across the piano to suggest seizure, her silence explained by the sham of a heart. But the wax betrayed them, the clock betrayed them, and now— He snapped his fingers. The lamp flared again. His monocle gleamed. "Now we shall see whose courage falters." The silence that followed was thick as velvet. Pritchard shifted, sweat beading his brow. Elsie whimpered. Hobbs looked down at his boots. Wimsey, watching them with the avid delight of a connoisseur, let the silence stretch until it grew unbearable. Then lightly he said, "Mr. Pritchard, would you oblige us by explaining why your handwriting appears upon the Tilbury chemist's receipt?" The butler's face collapsed. I only bought the candles. She asked me, she detested them," Wimsey cut in. "We know she did. The truth, Mr. Pritchard, if you please." Pritchard stammered, denied, protested, but his voice lacked conviction. At last he muttered that Paxton had visited, that he had been paid to leave the gate open, to procure the candles, to adjust the clock. And why, Wimsey asked silkily, would Paxton require a servant's collusion, unless he intended more than a visit? Pritchard swallowed. He said it was only to frighten her, to make her yield the warehouses, I swear it. "Ah," said Wimsey, "but Miss Fletch did not frighten easily. And when her heart resisted persuasion, Paxton, or his agent, found other means. The stage was set, Pritchard, and you were stage-hand." The butler broke, covering his face with thick hands. The household erupted in cries. Grantley snapped for silence. Wimsey rose, smoothing his coat. "There, Inspector, the theatrical reveal as promised, a shabby melodrama but revealing nonetheless. Our butler confesses his part, but the question remains, was Paxton himself the leading actor, or merely the ghostly prompter in the wings?" Grantley, grim now, declared they would have Pritchard held. Wimsey inclined his head, but his eyes sparkled with the thrill of unfinished work. "For you see, Inspector," he said, as they left the shuddering servants behind, "a play is never judged by its stage-hands, but by its star. We have unmasked the accomplice, but the principal, the true orchestrator, remains in the shadows, and I, for one, do not intend to let the curtain fall before the final bow." He tapped the piano lid with his cane as they passed. The sound rang out, hollow and resonant, like the echo of a note struck long ago, but never answered. "Come, Bunter," he murmured, "we must prepare for the unmasking." The following evening, Wimsey convened his assembly with all the relish of a conductor about to cue the final symphony. The rectory drawing-room had been scrubbed of its funereal atmosphere, though the piano still stood there, mute and accusing, its polished lid reflecting the lamplight like a dark pool. The servants gathered reluctantly, Elsie pale, Hobbs stolid, Pritchard cowed after the previous night's collapse. Inspector Grantley loomed at Whimsy's side, equal parts sceptical and impatient. Whimsy began in a tone of light banter, as though they had all met to play bridge. "Ladies and gentlemen, you have borne with me most patiently, for which I offer my deepest gratitude. I confess I am an insufferable bore when it comes to trifles, curtains, candles, clocks. Yet trifles, as the French say, make perfection, and perfection is no trifle. Tonight we bring them together." He paused, letting his words sink. His monocle glittered as he turned to Pritchard. "Yesterday you admitted to certain duties performed on another's behalf, buying candles, leaving gates unlatched, tampering with the clock. You were the stage hand, yes, but not the playwright. The question remains, who composed the drama in which poor Miss Fletch played her final part?" Pritchard muttered, eyes downcast. Whimsy continued, his tone sharpening. "Not Sir Lionel. Convenient though his debts are, he was in London by the time the curtain fell. His alibi, however distasteful to Inspector Grantley, holds water. Nor can we lay it all at the door of Richard Paxton, the vanished husband." "True," he returned, "and true he threatened, but Paxton alone could not have contrived so neat a play without help from within. Someone here used Paxton's reappearance as a cloak for their own ambition." The room stirred. Whimsy let the silence breathe before striking again. "Consider the candle, not Miss Fletch's taste, yet placed on her mantel. Consider the window hinges, oiled, though never before touched. Consider the hall clock, obligingly slow. Each detail required knowledge of the household's habits, knowledge intimate and habitual. Who possessed such knowledge? Not Paxton, who had been gone 30 years. Only those within these walls. He pivoted, gaze resting on Elsie. Our maid saw wax on the carpet, curtains open, a chair moved. Yet she hesitated to mention these things at first. Why? Because they seemed trivial, or because she feared implicating someone? Elsie burst into tears. "I never meant no harm, sir. I only did as I was told." "Ah," Whimsy said softly. "And who told you?" Her silence was damning enough. Bunter stepped forward with a paper. "My lord, the handwriting on the Tilbury chemist's receipt is not only Pritchard's. There is a second hand, neater, more feminine, upon the order, form itself." Whimsy accepted it with a little bow. "Thank you, Bunter. So we have a second hand in the affair. And who among us, having access to Miss Fletch's desk, the confidence to command servants, and the most to gain from her silence, would dare such forgery?" He turned slowly, the monocle fixed. "Mrs. Clay, the vicar's wife, if you would be so good as to step forward." The little woman gasped, paling to the lips. The vicar cried out, protesting, but Whimsy silenced him with a raised hand. "Come now, madam, you purchased the candles, did you not? You adjusted the clock, instructing Pritchard to look the other way. You opened the curtains, placed the chair, and arranged Miss Fletch in her final posture. Why? Because you had corresponded with Paxton yourself. You knew he was alive, you feared what he might reveal, and you coveted the warehouses that Miss Fletch alone controlled. A charitable fund for St. Mildred's, was it not? You fancied yourself its patroness. But Miss Fletch refused you, as she refused everyone, and so you determined she should refuse no longer. The vicar stammered, "This is monstrous, my wife—" "Monstrous, yes," said Whimsy, "but true. Recall, Inspector, the vicar's wife was the one who insisted upon making tea the night of the death. Who else had reason to fuss about kettles and cups while ensuring the household was gathered away from the drawing-room at the crucial moment? Who else would slip back, extinguish a lamp, light a candle, open curtains, and stage the scene for Hobbs to glimpse? And who else could silence Elsie, her maid, with nothing more than a command? Not Paxton, not Lionel, only she. All eyes turned. Mrs. Clay swayed, her hands clutching at the back of a chair. Wimsey pressed on, his voice iron beneath the banter. "The letter from Paxton gave you your chance. You feared his demand for the warehouses would expose your correspondence with him. Letters you thought long destroyed. You plotted to rid yourself of both him and Miss Fletch in one neat gesture. You bribed Pritchard," instructed Elsie, "tampered with clocks. And when Miss Fletch faltered, you staged her death as a seizure, but you forgot the wax, the hinges, the thread upon the carpet. And houses, Mrs. Clay, like God, remember everything." Inspector Grantley stepped forward, heavy and grim. "Well, madam, what have you to say?" For a moment she stood rigid, lips trembling. Then she laughed, high, brittle, terrifying. "Do you think she deserved to keep it all? Bitter, cruel, hoarding every penny while the church roof leaked? Paxton would have ruined her. And the village besides. I did what had to be done. For Ashcombe, for my husband, for the parish. She would never yield while she lived." Her words fell into silence like stones into water. The vicar groaned, covering his face. Elsie wept outright. Pritchard muttered a prayer. Wimsey exhaled a thin plume of smoke, his tone returning to airy mockery. "A noble motive, madam, redecorating God's house with murder. Unfortunately, juries are less appreciative of such aesthetic balances." Grantley moved in, placing a heavy hand upon her arm. She neither struggled nor resisted, only lifted her chin with sudden pride. "You will all thank me one day," she said. "The roof will be mended, you'll see." They led her away, the vicar stumbling beside her, broken. When the room had emptied, Wimsey tapped the piano lid once more, the sound echoing dully. "And so," he said softly to Bunter, "the piano no one played gave us its final note after all. Not Chopin, not Bach, but a dirge composed of wax, curtains, and silence. Our murderer could not resist turning life into theatre, and theatre, as ever, betrays its own illusions." Bunter inclined his head. "Very true, my lord." Wimsey lit another cigarette, quoting half under his breath. "All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players." He smiled, though his eyes were tired. "And some, Bunter, make very poor players indeed." He rose, gave a little bow toward the silent piano as though acknowledging its part, and declared with wry cheer, "Come, let us leave Inspector Grantley to tidy the scenery. The play is over." And with that, Lord Peter Wimsey departed Ashcombe, the echo of irony following him out into the cold night. The village of Ashcombe returned to its rhythms with the stubborn resilience of English parishes everywhere. The scandal at the rectory soon transformed into anecdote. Miss Fletch, poor soul, had died strangely. The villagers were fond of euphemism, while Mrs. Clay's name was spoken in tones of both horror and relish. The church roof, ironically, was repaired after all, donations flowing in from further afield, spurred on by the notoriety of the crime. Wimsey lingered at the Crown and Anchor only long enough to enjoy the peculiar English pleasure of overhearing gossip about himself. "Lordly sort of chap," the innkeeper said knowingly. "Talked a lot of nonsense, but he knew more than the police, mark my words." To which Bunter, polishing his master's cigarette case with unflappable discretion, made no reply. Inspector Grantley, less philosophical, visited Wimsey on his final morning. "Well, my lord," he said heavily, "you've had your way." The woman confessed. "Still, I'll never understand how you can spin murder out of candles and curtains." "My dear fellow," Wimsey answered, sipping his coffee, "murder always reveals itself in the small courtesies, the things people overlook. Grand passions are all very fine, but it's the tiny fibs that trip them. Wax on a carpet, grease on a hinge, a clock 20 minutes slow. Those are the murderer's calling cards, They cannot resist tinkering with the furniture. Grantley shook his head. It's beyond me." "Quite right," Whimsy said cheerfully. "It's beyond most of us, but I confess I rather enjoy the journey." When the inspector had gone, Bunter produced the morning's post. Among the envelopes lay a thin card, unsigned, bearing only a Latin epigraph in a neat, feminine hand. "Corruptio optimi pessima, the corruption of the best is the worst of all." Whimsy studied it with raised brows, then tucked it away without comment. "Souvenir of Ashcombe, my lord?" asked Bunter. "Perhaps," said Whimsy lightly. "Or perhaps a reminder that even vicars' wives are but clay. In either case, it will serve." By noon, Whimsy's Daimler rolled out of the village. He glanced back once at the church tower, now encased in scaffolding for its long-overdue repairs. The bells tolled with their usual cheer, but to Whimsy's ear they carried a faint discord, as though still echoing Miss Fletcher's complaint that they rang off-key. He laughed softly. Poor Honoria. She never touched a note, and yet her last performance was upon a piano no one played. Life does enjoy its ironies. Then, settling deeper into his seat, he quoted, half to himself and half to the misty fields sliding by. "Oft expectation fails, and most oft there where most it promises." Bunter, without looking up from his reading, murmured, "Very apt, my lord." And so they departed, leaving Ashcombe to its gossip and its ghosts. Lord Peter Whimsy whistling a tune, the case closed, the curtain dropped.